In 1849, a wedding photograph was taken at Blackwood Plantation in rural Alabama. The image shows two young white women in identical lace gowns, standing side by side with expressions that historians would later describe as haunted. For over 170 years, this photograph remained locked in a private collection, its true story buried beneath layers of silence and deliberate erasure. The women were sisters, Margaret and Catherine Whitmore, daughters of one of Alabama's most powerful plantation families. But the photograph concealed a secret so disturbing that entire generations conspired to hide it from official records. Recent archival discoveries in 2024 revealed handwritten letters, encrypted diary entries, and testimony from descendants that exposed the truth. Both sisters had entered into forbidden unions with the same enslaved man named Samuel. These weren't marriages in any legal sense. The law explicitly forbade such unions, but rather arrangements orchestrated within the plantation's hidden world, where power, control, and systematic abuse created situations that defy modern comprehension. The photograph itself was a facade, a carefully constructed lie meant to present respectability to the outside world, while concealing the plantation's darkest operations. What makes this case particularly chilling is how thoroughly it was erased. No birth records exist for the children born from these unions. No legal documents acknowledge Samuel's existence beyond property inventories. The only reason we know this story today is because of a single trunk discovered in 2024 in the attic of the Whitmore family's abandoned estate, containing letters written in Margaret's hand that documented years of anguish, coercion, and a reproductive program designed by the plantation matriarch herself. This is the story of how two sisters became prisoners in their own home, how an enslaved man was forced into an impossible situation, and how a powerful family buried evidence of their crimes for over a century. It's a story about the darkest corners of slavery's legacy, where even the oppressors could become victims of the system's cruelty, and where the enslaved endured unspeakable violations that history chose to forget. The discovery of this case has reopened questions about how many similar arrangements existed across the South, hidden behind wedding photographs and respectable facades. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that slavery's horrors extended far beyond what official records reveal, and that countless stories like this one remain buried, waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 1. The Photograph That Couldn't Speak. There are 176 years, in a plantation house that stood on the outskirts of Montgomery County, Alabama, a wedding photograph was taken that would haunt everyone who eventually learned its true meaning. Military correspondence from the era and scattered county records mentioned the Whitmore family only in passing, wealthy, influential, untouchable. But in 2024, when historians finally gained access to the family's private archives after the estate's abandonment, they discovered that this photograph was not documenting a celebration, it was documenting a crime. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The photograph shows two young women, Margaret and Catherine Whitmore, ages 23 and 19 respectively. They wear identical wedding gowns made of imported French lace, their faces pale and expressionless beneath elaborate veils. Standard wedding portraits of the 1840s typically showed joy, or at least serene satisfaction. These faces show nothing. They are masks. For decades, family members who glimpsed this photograph assumed it documented a double wedding, perhaps to brothers or cousins, which was common among wealthy Southern families consolidating land and power. The truth was far more disturbing. There was no double wedding to respectable gentlemen. There were no grooms standing beside them that day. The photograph was a theatrical production, a piece of evidence manufactured to create a false narrative for outsiders, while concealing what was actually happening within Blackwood Plantation's hidden quarters. Margaret Whitmore was the eldest daughter of Colonel James Whitmore and his wife, Dorothea, who managed the plantation's daily operations with an iron will. Catherine, 4 years younger, had been raised to obey her mother without question. Both young women had received the education typical of their class, French, piano, needlework, and the management of household slaves. They were being prepared for advantageous marriages to strengthen the family's political and economic position. But Dorothea Whitmore had other plans. Plans that would never appear in any official record. Plans that would transform her daughters into participants in one of the plantation's most carefully guarded secrets. According to letters discovered in 2024, Dorothea had become obsessed with what she called selective cultivation, a breeding program designed to produce enslaved workers with specific physical and mental characteristics. She had identified an enslaved man named Samuel, 26 years old, as the centerpiece of this program. Samuel had been born on the plantation. Records indicate he possessed exceptional intelligence and physical strength, qualities that made him valuable but also dangerous in Dorothea's eyes. Rather than sell him or risk him escaping, she devised a plan to ensure his complete control while using him to further her breeding objectives. The plan involved her own daughters. The discovered letters reveal Margaret's growing horror as she realized what her mother intended. In one letter dated March 1849, Margaret wrote to a cousin, "Mother speaks of arrangements that make my soul recoil. She says duty to family requires sacrifices that God himself would forgive, but I fear God will never forgive what she asks of us." The cousin's response, also preserved in the trunk, advised silence and obedience. "Your mother's wisdom has sustained your family's position. Trust in her judgment, however difficult it may seem." By June 1849, both sisters had been informed of their mother's directive. They would enter into secret unions with Samuel, unions that existed only within the plantation's boundaries, hidden from neighbors, concealed from visiting relatives, never acknowledged in any legal capacity. The children born from these arrangements would be classified as enslaved property, their maternal lineage deliberately obscured in plantation records. The sisters would continue to live in the main house, presenting themselves as unmarried daughters devoted to family duty. The wedding photograph was taken to provide cover. If questions arose about the sisters' unmarried status or about children seen around the property, the family could claim the sisters had married but their husbands died shortly after, or that the children belonged to trusted enslaved house servants. The photograph became evidence of a lie, proof of respectability that never existed. What the photograph cannot show is Samuel's face. He was not present when it was taken. He had no choice in any of this. The letters suggest he was told explicitly that resistance would result in his sale to the Deep South cotton fields, separated forever from his mother and siblings who also lived at Blackwood. He was trapped in a situation where every option meant suffering, where even his own body became a tool of oppression orchestrated by the very women who were simultaneously victims of their mother's cruelty. The photograph was filed away, rarely shown, eventually forgotten as the Whitmore family's power faded after the Civil War. But it survived. A haunting image that would one day force us to confront a truth that official records worked so hard to erase. Chapter 2. The Matriarch's Design. Dorothea Whitmore's obsession with selective breeding didn't emerge suddenly. Letters and diary entries discovered in 2024 reveal a woman who had spent years studying agricultural journals about livestock breeding and had begun applying those same principles to enslaved people on her plantation. She kept detailed records of bloodlines, physical characteristics, and what she called temperament assessments, all hidden in ledgers that were never meant to be seen by outsiders. Colonel James Whitmore, though the legal owner of Blackwood Plantation, spent most of his time in Montgomery conducting political business and managing investments. The day-to-day operations fell entirely to Dorothea, who ruled the plantation with meticulous control. Enslaved workers who lived through that era, and whose testimonies were later recorded by their descendants, described her as the woman who saw people as crops to be cultivated and harvested. Dorothea's interest in Samuel began in 1847, when he was 24 years old. He had taught himself to read despite the severe punishment such knowledge could bring. He could perform complex mathematical calculations, repair machinery, and had developed a system for improving crop yields that had significantly increased the plantation's profits. These qualities made him extraordinarily valuable, but in Dorothea's mind they also represented genetic traits that should be preserved and multiplied within her labor force. The letters reveal that Dorothea initially considered arranging unions between Samuel and enslaved women she deemed suitable, but she became concerned that any children born from such arrangements might be sold away by her husband if financial pressures arose, as had happened with other valuable enslaved families. She needed absolute certainty that Samuel's offspring would remain on the plantation permanently, under her complete control. Her solution was monstrously calculated. If her own daughters bore Samuel's children, those children would carry Whitmore blood. While legally they would be classified as enslaved due to their father's status, Dorothea believed she could ensure they remained at Blackwood indefinitely, trained from birth to be the next generation of skilled plantation workers, intelligent enough to manage complex tasks but bound by their legal status to never leave. Margaret's letters from early 1849 show her desperate attempts to resist. She wrote to her father in Montgomery, begging him to intervene, but received only a brief reply telling her to honor your mother's wisdom in household matters. She appealed to the local minister, but he advised that a daughter's duty was obedience to parental authority. She even considered fleeing to relatives in Virginia, but her mother had anticipated this and restricted her movements, claiming Margaret was needed to help manage the household. Catherine, younger and more thoroughly dominated by their mother, accepted the situation with what letters describe as hollow resignation. One letter from Margaret describes finding Catherine in the garden at dawn, staring at nothing, and when asked if she was well, Catherine replied, "I am what mother requires me to be. Nothing more exists." The arrangements were formalized in the summer of 1849 in a ceremony that mocked every notion of marriage. No minister was present. Dorothea herself read selected Bible passages about duty and obedience. Samuel was brought to the plantation's small chapel, where both sisters stood waiting. According to a testimony given decades later by an elderly woman whose grandmother witnessed the event, Samuel's face showed no emotion at all. He had learned long ago that displaying feelings only invited additional suffering. Dorothea explained the rules. Samuel would divide his time between separate quarters assigned to each daughter. The sisters would live in adjacent rooms in the main house. Children born from these unions would be given minimal recorded information, first names only, birth dates approximated, parentage listed simply as house property. Samuel would continue his skilled work on the plantation but would be permitted limited contact with the children to teach them practical skills. The wedding photograph was taken that same week. Dorothea arranged for a traveling photographer who specialized in plantation family portraits. He was told the sisters were celebrating their engagements to gentlemen who were away on business. He took the photograph, received his payment, and left, never knowing he had documented evidence of a crime that would remain hidden for over 170 years. In the months that followed, the plantation's records show nothing unusual. Visitors came and went, seeing only the respected Whitmore family maintaining their social position. The truth was confined to a few rooms in the main house and the small quarters where Samuel lived in a state of captivity that defied simple categorization. He was enslaved property but also unwillingly bound to the white family in ways that violated every legal and moral boundary of the era. Chapter 3. The Children Who Never Existed. The first child was born in May 1850. Margaret delivered a son in the main house, attended only by her mother and two enslaved women sworn to absolute secrecy. No birth announcement appeared in the local newspaper. No family friends were informed. The plantation's birth records listed the child simply as Thomas, born to house property, May 1850. His mother's name was omitted entirely. Now, I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts can reach. Margaret's letters from this period show a woman destroyed by conflicting emotions. She loved her son with desperate intensity, but that love was poisoned by the circumstances of his birth and the knowledge of what his future held. In one letter she wrote, "I hold him and feel my heart break with love, knowing that same love condemns him to a life I would give anything to spare him." What mother willingly births her child into chains? The child was kept in Margaret's room for the first year, then moved to quarters separate from both the main house and the slave quarters, a middle space that reflected his impossible status. He was neither free nor fully enslaved in the traditional sense. He was Dorothea's property, but with a connection to the white family that made his position uniquely precarious. Catherine's first child, a daughter, was born in December 1850. The same pattern followed: secret delivery, minimal records, immediate separation from public knowledge. The plantation's ledgers listed her as Mary, born to house property, December 1850. Like Thomas, she existed in official records only as property inventory. Between 1850 and 1858, 6 more children were born from these forced arrangements. Each birth was concealed from outsiders. Each child was classified as enslaved property, despite having a white mother. Dorothea maintained meticulous private records of their bloodlines, tracking the traits she considered desirable, planning which children would be trained for which plantation roles. Samuel's position during these years was documented only in fragments. One letter from Margaret mentions seeing him teaching Thomas to read in the barn, tears streaming down his face as he tried to give his son tools for survival. Another fragment describes Samuel attempting to protect Mary from a punishment Dorothea had ordered, and being whipped himself as a result. The children grew up in isolation, never fully belonging anywhere. They were too closely connected to the white family to live in the slave quarters, but their legal status meant they could never be acknowledged as part of the family. They were educated beyond what was typical for enslaved children. Dorothea wanted them skilled and intelligent, but that education only made their captivity more agonizing. Plantation records show that by 1858, Dorothea's experiment had produced 8 children between the two sisters, but the human cost was incalculable. Margaret's later letters describe episodes of profound despair, moments when she considered taking her own life to escape the moral weight of what she had been forced to participate in. Catherine stopped writing anything at all after 1855, her silence itself a form of testimony about psychological destruction. The children were given basic provisions and training in valuable skills: carpentry, metalwork, advanced agriculture, household management. They were Dorothea's investment in the plantation's future, but they were also living evidence of crimes that could destroy the Whitmore family's reputation if revealed. As the children reached adolescence, that evidence became increasingly dangerous. The Civil War's approach would force Dorothea to make decisions about these children that would haunt the family for generations. But before that reckoning came, another tragedy would fracture the already broken household. A tragedy that began with Samuel's desperate attempt to give his children something Dorothea had never intended them to have: hope for freedom. Chapter 4. The Whispered Rebellion. In 1859, the fragile equilibrium at Blackwood Plantation began to crack. Samuel, now 37 years old, had endured a decade of impossible circumstances. He had watched his children grow up in legal bondage, had seen Margaret's spirit slowly crushed, had witnessed Catherine retreat into near catatonic silence. According to testimonies preserved by descendants, he began speaking to the children about a different possible future, one that would require courage, patience, and faith that the world might one day change. These conversations happened in stolen moments, while working in the barn during brief encounters in the plantation's far fields, in whispered exchanges when Dorothea's attention was elsewhere. Samuel taught the older children about the growing tensions between North and South, about the increasing debates over slavery, about the possibility that the institution itself might not last forever. He told them they must survive, must preserve their intelligence and skills, because freedom might come within their lifetimes. One of the children, Thomas, now 9 years old, began keeping a secret journal. This journal, discovered in 2024 along with the letters, provides the only first-hand account from a child's perspective of life in this impossible situation. His early entries are heartbreaking in their simplicity. Father says there are places where people like us can be free. Mother cries when she thinks no one sees. Grandmother watches everything. Margaret noticed the subtle change in Thomas's demeanor, a spark of hope that frightened her because she knew how dangerous hope could be for enslaved people. In a letter to her sister, she wrote, "I see Samuel's influence in Thomas's eyes. He begins to imagine possibilities that will only bring him suffering if he speaks them aloud. How do I warn my son that hope itself is dangerous when Dorothea would punish even the thought of freedom?" Dorothea detected the shift as well. She had spent years carefully controlling every aspect of the plantation's operations, and she recognized the signs of potential resistance. In late 1859, she implemented new restrictions. Samuel's contact with the children was reduced. The older children were separated into different work assignments. Punishments for small infractions became more severe, designed to crush any developing sense of autonomy. But Dorothea had underestimated how thoroughly Samuel had already planted seeds of resistance. The children had begun communicating with each other through subtle signals, passing information about the world beyond the plantation, sharing what Samuel had taught them. Thomas's journal documents a network of whispered conversations that happened despite Dorothea's surveillance. In February 1860, a critical incident occurred. Mary, Catherine's eldest daughter, now 9 years old, was overheard by Dorothea asking another enslaved worker about the North. The worker, terrified of being implicated in what Dorothea would consider seditious talk, immediately reported the conversation. Dorothea's response was swift and brutal. Mary was confined to isolation for a week, given minimal food, and subjected to Dorothea's lectures about the proper place of enslaved people and the consequences of entertaining dangerous ideas. Margaret attempted to intervene, pleading with her mother to show mercy to a child. The confrontation revealed how much power Dorothea still held. Margaret's letter describing the incident recounts her mother's chilling response. "These children exist because I willed it. They are my property, my creation, and they will serve the purpose I designed them for. Your maternal feelings are irrelevant. If you interfere again, I will remind you that Samuel's continued presence here depends entirely on my goodwill." The threat was clear. Samuel could be sold at any moment. The children could be separated and sold separately if Dorothea chose. Margaret and Catherine had no legal rights over children classified as enslaved property. Regardless of biological maternity, they were powerless. Samuel learned of Mary's punishment and made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. According to multiple accounts preserved in descendants' testimonies, he began planning an escape, not for himself alone, but for all 8 children. It was a desperate plan, probably doomed to fail, but it represented his refusal to accept that his children would spend their entire lives in captivity. He began gathering resources, small amounts of food, blankets, basic tools. He identified a route north, connecting with the Underground Railroad network through contacts among enslaved workers on neighboring plantations. He waited for a moment when the plantation's security would be weakest. That moment came in August 1860, when Colonel Whitmore took most of the plantation's overseers to Montgomery for a political convention. Thomas's journal provides the only detailed account of what happened next. "Father came to us in the night. He said we would leave, all of us together. He said we would be free. Mother held me and wept. Grandmother appeared before we could reach the door." Dorothea had anticipated the escape attempt. She had been watching Samuel carefully, had noticed the small preparations, had positioned trusted overseers to prevent exactly this scenario. The children were stopped before they left the plantation grounds. Samuel was captured immediately. What followed was a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to crush any future resistance. Dorothea did not sell Samuel. That would have been too merciful. Instead, she ensured he remained on the plantation, but implemented new restrictions that were psychologically devastating. His contact with the children was eliminated entirely. He was moved to isolated quarters. He was forced to watch from a distance as his children were brought to the main house to witness their father's punishment and humiliation. Margaret's letters from September 1860 describe her complete emotional collapse. She wrote, "I watched Mother destroy what little hope remained in these children's hearts. I am complicit in this. I am damned." Chapter 5. The War That Changed Nothing. When war erupted in 1861, many enslaved people across the South began to hope that freedom might finally come. But at Blackwood Plantation, the war years brought only new forms of suffering for Samuel and the 8 children trapped in Dorothea's carefully constructed system of control. Colonel Whitmore joined the Confederate military in the war's early months, leaving Dorothea with complete authority over plantation operations. With male overseers departing for military service, she relied increasingly on surveillance, psychological manipulation, and strategic cruelty to maintain order. The children, now ranging from age 3 to 11, became both her workforce and her prisoners. Thomas's journal from this period shows the children forced into intensive labor, beyond what was typical even for enslaved children. They worked in the fields during planting and harvest, performed skilled carpentry and metalwork repairs, and managed complex household operations. Dorothea justified this by claiming the war's demands required everyone to contribute, but the reality was darker. She was conditioning them for lives of permanent servitude, regardless of what the war's outcome might bring. Margaret and Catherine existed in a state of psychological paralysis during these years. Margaret's letters show her awareness that the Confederate cause was probably doomed, that slavery itself might be abolished, but she could see no path forward for the children even if that happened. She wrote in 1862, "If freedom comes, what becomes of children who officially don't exist? Will they be free or will they be erased? Mother has ensured their births were never properly recorded, their parentage never acknowledged. In trying to keep them here forever, she may have condemned them to a different kind of invisibility." Samuel remained in isolation, performing heavy labor but barred from contact with his children. Several accounts from other enslaved workers on the plantation describe seeing him watching from a distance as the children worked, his face marked by a grief so profound, it disturbed even those who had witnessed countless horrors under slavery. In 1863, as news of the Emancipation Proclamation spread through the South, Dorothea implemented what she called protective measures. She moved the children to a hidden section of the plantation property, claiming to visitors that she had sent them to relatives in Mississippi for their safety. In reality, she was concealing them from any possibility of Union forces discovering their existence and freeing them. The children spent months in near isolation, tended only by two elderly enslaved women who Dorothea trusted completely. Thomas's journal entries from this period show the children beginning to understand that their situation was different from that of other enslaved people on the plantation. He wrote, "The others talk of freedom coming, but we are not like the others. Grandmother says we belong to her in ways the law doesn't understand. I begin to fear she is right." When Union forces did briefly pass through the area in 1864, Dorothea had already prepared elaborate cover stories. The children were presented as orphaned relatives from a deceased branch of the family, being raised out of Christian charity. Union officers focused on larger military objectives and accustomed to the complex dynamics of Southern households didn't investigate further. The war ended in April 1865. Slavery was abolished. Across the South, 4 million people celebrated freedom, but at Blackwood Plantation, the children's situation remained fundamentally unchanged. Dorothea had maneuvered to ensure they had no legal documentation of their enslaved status, which paradoxically meant they also had no documentation proving they should be freed. They existed in an administrative void. Samuel was technically free but had nowhere to go and no resources. His children were legally ambiguous, not enslaved in the traditional sense, but not free either. Dorothea offered him a deal. He could remain on the plantation as a paid worker, could see his children but only if he agreed to never speak about their true parentage or the circumstances of their births. He accepted because he had no other option. Freedom had come to millions, but not to him. Margaret's letter from June 1865 captures the crushing disappointment. The world has changed, yet nothing here has changed. Mother has found ways to preserve her control even as the old system collapses around us. The children are trapped not by law now, but by lies, by the absence of truth in any official record. The post-war years saw Dorothea use the children's ambiguous status to her advantage. To outsiders, they were family dependents or adopted charity cases. To the local community, they were simply the Whitmore household help. No one investigated too closely. The South was in chaos. Record-keeping was inconsistent, and families everywhere had complicated situations they preferred not to explain. The children grew into adolescence and adulthood in this state of limbo. They were educated beyond what most formerly enslaved people could access, but that education came with psychological bondage. They knew the truth of who they were but couldn't speak it. They were technically free but functionally imprisoned by the web of lies and absent documentation Dorothea had created. Chapter 6. The Price of Silence. By 1870, the oldest children were entering adulthood, and the impossible contradictions of their existence were becoming harder to maintain. Thomas, now 20 years old, had developed exceptional skills in metalworking and engineering. Mary, also 20, had become Dorothea's de facto household manager, overseeing operations with remarkable competence. The younger children were similarly skilled, educated far beyond what the post-war South typically provided to black citizens, yet trapped in a household that refused to acknowledge their true identities. If this story has already drawn you in, leave a like. It helps the story of the Whitmore family reach more people. Dorothea, now in her 60s, maintained her iron control through a combination of economic manipulation and psychological warfare. The children had nowhere else to go. They had no legal documentation of their births, no official acknowledgement of their parentage, and no resources to start independent lives. Dorothea paid them minimal wages, justifying this by claiming they received room and board and family support. Samuel, now 48 years old, had aged dramatically. The decades of psychological torture had broken something fundamental in him. He worked in the plantation's workshop, taught the younger children practical skills, but rarely spoke except when necessary. An account from a neighboring farmer describes encountering Samuel in 1871. I asked him how he fared in these changed times. He looked at me with eyes that held no light and said only, "I fare as I am permitted to fare." Margaret and Catherine, now in their 40s, lived in different states of resignation. Margaret's letters show her plagued by guilt and powerlessness. She had watched her children, and they were her children despite all the legal fictions, grow up in captivity she had been forced to help create. She wrote in 1872, "I believed that slavery's end would free them. I was naive. Mother found new chains that don't require laws to enforce them." Catherine had essentially stopped functioning as an independent person. Accounts from this period describe her as a ghost in the house, performing basic tasks but emotionally absent. The trauma of what she had endured had destroyed her capacity for normal engagement with the world. The children themselves began to understand that they needed to leave if they were ever to have actual lives, but departing meant abandoning their parents and siblings and stepping into a world that might not accept them. Thomas's journal from 1873 shows him wrestling with this decision. Father tells me I should go, should find a life beyond this place. But how do I leave Mary and the others? How do I abandon Mother, who suffered to give me life even as she couldn't save me? How do I walk away from Father, who has already lost so much? In 1874, a crisis forced the situation to a breaking point. One of the younger children, Sarah, now 18, attracted the attention of a young man from a neighboring property. He was black, freeborn, educated, and completely unaware of Sarah's true background. When he began courting her formally, Dorothea was faced with a dilemma: allow the relationship to proceed and risk exposure of the family's secrets, or prevent it and reveal the extent of her control over someone who was supposedly free. Dorothea chose prevention. She informed the young man that Sarah was not suitable for marriage, claiming vague family complications without explanation. The young man, offended but persistent, began asking questions in the local community. Dorothea responded by restricting Sarah's movements and spreading rumors that Sarah was mentally unstable, a common tactic used to discredit women who threatened social order. Sarah's response was to attempt escape. In November 1874, she disappeared from the plantation. Thomas's journal describes the panic that followed. Sarah has fled. Father helped her, I know he did. Grandmother rages, threatens to involve authorities, to claim Sarah stole from the household. But what can she really do? If she reports Sarah officially, questions might be asked that she doesn't want answered. Sarah made it to Birmingham, where she found work and began building a life under an assumed identity. She never returned to Blackwood Plantation. Her departure was never officially reported, never investigated. She simply vanished from the family's records and from her siblings' lives. Her escape triggered a cascade of decisions among the other children. Between 1875 and 1880, 5 more of the children gradually left the plantation. Some went north, some to other southern cities, all taking new names, constructing new identities, carefully hiding their origins. They maintained minimal contact with each other through intermediaries, fearful that any connection could expose their past. Only Thomas and Mary remained. Thomas because he couldn't bring himself to abandon his parents entirely. Mary because the psychological trauma of her upbringing had left her unable to imagine life anywhere else. They continued working at Blackwood, now almost completely isolated, watching their younger siblings disappear into new lives, while they remained trapped by loyalty and fear. Samuel died in 1882 at age 60. No death certificate was filed with the county. No obituary appeared in any newspaper. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the plantation property. Thomas's journal entry for that day reads simply, "Father is gone. He suffered more than any human should suffer. I pray God grants him the peace he never found here." Margaret survived until 1891, dying at 65. Her final letters show her still seeking forgiveness for her role in the children's suffering, still trying to rationalize what had been done to her and what she had been forced to participate in. She asked repeatedly for Thomas to forgive her. His journal indicates he did, but the forgiveness was complicated, wrapped in his own unresolved pain. Catherine died in 1895, having spent the final 20 years of her life in near-complete psychological withdrawal. No one outside the immediate household seemed to notice her passing. Dorothea lived until 1898, dying at age 87, never acknowledging any wrongdoing, never expressing regret for the system of suffering she had created. Her death marked the end of the generation that had directly perpetuated the crime, but the consequences would ripple forward through decades. Chapter 7. The Scattered Descendants. The children who escaped Blackwood Plantation and built new lives had to make impossible choices. They couldn't acknowledge their origins without inviting questions that might expose not only their own pasts, but also compromise the siblings they left behind. They created elaborate cover stories, false birth records, and entirely fictional family histories. They lived in constant fear that someone might discover the truth. Sarah, who had fled first in 1874, settled in Birmingham under the name Sarah Collins. She told people she was from Mississippi, orphaned during the war, raised by kind folks who had passed away. She found work as a seamstress, married a railroad worker, and had 4 children. Her descendants, interviewed by historians in 2024, knew nothing of her real origins until the Blackwood documents were discovered. One great-granddaughter said, "We always knew grandmother Sarah was secretive about her past, but we assumed it was just painful war memories. Learning the truth has been devastating." The other children scattered across the South and into northern cities. One made it to Philadelphia, working in shipyards and eventually becoming a skilled foreman. Another settled in New Orleans, finding community among the city's complex racial hierarchies where questions about background were often avoided. A third went to Texas, claiming to be Mexican to avoid the rigid black-white classifications of most southern states. Each created a new identity. Each lived with the knowledge that their very existence was evidence of crimes that powerful people wanted forgotten. Each raised children who knew nothing of their true heritage because speaking that truth was simply too dangerous. Thomas and Mary, who remained at Blackwood, watched the plantation decline as Alabama's economy struggled in the post-war decades. The property, once grand, fell into disrepair. Most of the former enslaved workers who hadn't left during the war eventually moved on, seeking opportunities elsewhere. By the 1890s, Blackwood was essentially abandoned except for Thomas, Mary, and a few elderly workers who had nowhere else to go. Thomas married in 1886 to a local woman who knew only that he worked at the plantation, nothing of his real background. He had 3 children with her, raising them in ignorance of their heritage because he couldn't see any way to tell them the truth that wouldn't destroy them. His journal from this period shows his ongoing internal conflict. "My children ask about their grandparents. What do I tell them? That their grandmother was white, their grandfather enslaved, and I am the product of an arrangement so twisted that even now I can't fully speak about it." Mary never married. She continued managing what remained of the plantation household until 1920, living in the main house that had been her prison her entire life. Local records describe her as the Whitmore household manager, never as family, never with her true relationship to the property acknowledged. The wedding photograph that started this story remained in the main house during all these decades, stored in a trunk with other family documents. As the Whitmore family line dwindled and the plantation changed hands repeatedly, these documents were packed away, moved to storage, eventually to an attic where they sat forgotten until 2024. The children who had created new identities never forgot their origins, but they couldn't speak them. Several left written accounts that their descendants discovered only after their deaths. Journals, letters, cryptic notes that hinted at complicated pasts without fully revealing them. These fragments eventually led researchers to the larger truth, but only after more than a century had passed. One particularly poignant discovery was a letter written by Sarah in 1920 to a sibling she hadn't seen in 45 years. The letter was never sent, found in her belongings after her death. It read, "I think of you often. I wonder if you remember the barn where Father taught us to read. The secret conversations, the hope we once felt that freedom would change everything. I wonder if you're as alone with this history as I am, carrying a past we can never fully explain to those we love." The psychological cost of this enforced silence was immense. Multiple descendants interviewed in 2024 reported that their ancestors had shown signs of deep trauma, nightmares, sudden emotional episodes, mysterious sadness that seemed to have no present cause. One descendant recalled her grandmother crying while looking at old photographs, saying only, "There are stories I can't tell you, stories that would break your heart to know." By the 1950s, most of the original 8 children had died, taking their full stories to their graves. Their descendants lived scattered across America, some successful, some struggling, none aware they were connected to each other or to a plantation in Alabama, where extraordinary crimes had been committed and concealed. The wedding photograph, meanwhile, remained in the attic of the abandoned Whitmore estate, waiting for someone to finally understand what it really documented. Chapter 8. The Discovery. In 2022, the Blackwood plantation property was purchased by a real estate developer planning to convert it into a wedding venue, an irony that wouldn't be apparent until later. During initial renovation assessments, workers discovered the attic contained dozens of trunks and boxes that had been sealed for decades. Local historical preservation regulations required that these materials be reviewed before any could be discarded. The developer contacted the Alabama State Historical Society, which assigned a team of historians to examine the contents. Among them was Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a specialist in Southern family histories and slavery records. What she found in those trunks would consume the next 2 years of her life and expose one of the most disturbing concealed cases in Alabama's historical record. The wedding photograph. was in the first trunk opened. Dr. Morrison initially assumed it was a standard 19th century wedding portrait and nearly set it aside as unremarkable. But something about the sisters' expressions caught her attention, a haunted quality that seemed inconsistent with typical wedding photographs of the era. Deeper in the same trunk, she found Margaret's letters. The first few seemed ordinary, but as Dr. Morrison read chronologically, the horror began to emerge. Phrases like mother's arrangements and the children who cannot be acknowledged hinted at something deeply wrong. References to Samuel appeared repeatedly, always in contexts that suggested his presence at the plantation was involuntary and complicated. The breakthrough came when Dr. Morrison found Margaret's 1849 letter to her cousin, the one explicitly describing Dorothea's plan for selective cultivation involving the sisters and an enslaved man. Dr. Morrison, who had researched slavery for 15 years and thought she had encountered every variant of its cruelty, found herself physically shaken by what she was reading. She immediately called her research partner, Dr. James Washington, a historian specializing in enslaved family structures. Together, they began systematically cataloging every document in the trunks. They found Thomas's journal, which provided first-hand testimony from one of the children. They found Catherine's earlier letters showing her psychological deterioration. They found Dorothea's private ledgers, with their clinical notations about the children's births and development. They also found the encrypted sections of Dorothea's diary, which required months of work to decode. When they finally cracked the encryption, they discovered Dorothea's own justifications for what she had done, passages describing her breeding program as necessary for the family's future prosperity, and the sisters' participation as unfortunate but required sacrifices for the greater good. Dr. Morrison later testified at an academic conference, "I have studied slavery's documentation for my entire career. I thought I understood its depths. But reading a white woman's calculated plans to use her own daughters in a breeding program with an enslaved man, reading her justifications written in calm, logical language, it revealed dimensions of slavery's evil that I hadn't fully conceptualized." The research team expanded, bringing in genealogists to trace what had happened to the 8 children. This required connecting fragmentary records across multiple states, finding descendants who had no idea of their connection to each other, and piecing together how the children had scattered and rebuilt their lives. The genealogical work took over a year. Researchers tracked down descendants of 5 of the 8 children, Sarah in Birmingham's lineage, Thomas's descendants in Alabama, and 3 others who had gone north. 2 of the children's lines couldn't be traced beyond the early 20th century, lost in the gaps and migrations of that era. When researchers contacted descendants with their findings, the reactions ranged from disbelief to grief to anger. Many had family stories about mysterious grandparents or great-grandparents who wouldn't discuss their pasts, but none had imagined anything like this. One descendant said, "My grandmother used to tell us she came from complicated circumstances and wouldn't say more. Now I understand why. How do you tell your children that your mother was white, your father enslaved, and your existence was the result of a breeding program?" The discovery also required confronting the reality that Margaret and Catherine were simultaneously victims and participants in the system. They had no power to refuse their mother's demands, but they had cooperated with the concealment and had benefited from the plantation's wealth built on enslaved labor. This complexity made easy moral judgments impossible,